invitation, and this is one of the very rare occasions where the European Parliament has a distinct majority in panels. This compensates for the events that Parliament cannot attend when it has plenary session in Strasbourg. If you would allow me, I would comment. I was also asked to comment on what our MEP said, and I would like to attach a few comments of my own to that. And not only the MEPs, but of course also Ms. Janina, and I very much liked the expression you used, let's not talk the talk, but walk the talk. And I think this is valid also very much for the EU institutions. And if we see this Western Balkan strategy of the Commission, as we call it in short, as a turning point, then the Commission should consider it its Bible, to use this rather Christian expression, and also live up to what is said in this document. And I already see some inconsistencies. Let me give 2 examples. First of all, there is the concept of bilateral disputes, and reconciliation is revived, so to say. But why then 2 months later, in the country report of Bosnia and Herzegovina, for instance, there is not a single mention of the word reconciliation? This to me is striking. The Western Balkan strategy also says, I literally, or almost literally quote, that all the countries have elements of state capture. I would like to see that this is bold language, and we all applauded the tougher and bolder language used by the Commission in this document. I would like to see then in the country reports for each individual country a section which says, in the case of Montenegro, Serbia, Kosovo, etc., the elements of state capture identified by the Commission are 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. I mean, this is something I am missing in that document. And I had the impression when reading the strategy that the Commission was also a bit oblivious of its 2015 enlargement strategy, where there is much more explicit talk about reconciliation, and where there is also a reference to the Vienna Declaration, I mean, referring to the Vienna Summit as part of the Berlin process, on bilateral disputes. Why is this reference not included in the Western Balkan strategy last February? Because it is a very important declaration which was made and nothing was done with it since 2015. All neighboring EU member states were invited to co-sign this declaration. None of them did. I mean, it is high time we held both sides accountable for that situation. Now, like Toby already mentioned it, I mean, thank you, Mr. Weitz, for bringing up this very interesting and completely underexposed issue about the double nationalities and the Bosniaks risking to be left alone, so to say. Mr. Jambaski referred to the Friendship Treaty, which indeed I also think was kind of a catalyst also for the entire name dispute issue. I personally would rather not have seen the word used again, and it's almost becoming commonplace when something interesting or a breakthrough happens to call it historic. I mean, I also applaud this agreement, but at the same time I was thinking of all the language used on Cyprus. We also used momentum, historic window of opportunity, now or never, and we see that despite that it collapsed. I mean, when you have a closer look at the agreement, there is a lot of nitty-gritty there that will make implementation very difficult indeed. Mr. Radoš pointed to the situation of media freedom in Montenegro, mentioning in particular the public broadcaster. We had not the resignation, the dismissal of Ms. Kadia a few days ago. So despite warnings from the European Union, and despite 3 consecutive mentions in the reports of the Commission that there is no progress on media freedom in Montenegro, things are deteriorating. There was also the attack and it was not the first attack on Mira Lakic, the reporter of VSD, which makes me think, and this is something which is of course not explicitly mentioned in the Western Balkans strategy, that if you want to become a member in 2025, you'd better make sure that you are ready by the end of 2022, because there is a very long ratification process and maybe some cumbersome issues coming up at the last moment, as we saw in the last half year before the accession of Croatia. Now, interestingly, in the case of Montenegro and on freedom of expression, this means that 4.5 years after opening negotiations on chapters 23 and 24, we see where we are on media freedom, and there is exactly the same amount of time to go before we need to have an accession treaty ready to be submitted for ratification. I think that is worrying. We have a similar situation in Serbia. Ms. Di Monte raised a very valid point of the property issue, which is also, in my view, underexposed, and it may soon pop up on the agenda of our interparliamentary meeting. I would personally applaud that. Another very tricky issue in Montenegro is the environment chapter. I think the authorities are underestimating that. Mr. Peterle also referred to the name dispute and the whole historic background. I want to use the opportunity to draw attention to the recent Jean Monnet dialogue, which was launched with the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, as we still have, to say, which means that the European Parliament continues to be very much involved, and it will also be a forum to try and maintain pressure to make the best of this historic, as it was said, agreement. Mr. Kukan, you mentioned the stable progress, but the pace which is not always okay. This brings me to the Serbian authorities' disappointment for the second time in a row that only 2 chapters will be opened in June, while they say they are ready to open 5. My private and now public advice to the Serbian authorities would be like, listen, maybe this is a soft diplomatic signal that you should do more on chapters 23 and 24, because nobody wants to use this overall balance clause, which is in the negotiating framework, which means that if things do not evolve rapidly enough in chapters 23, 24, the opening of additional chapters may temporarily be blocked. So maybe opening just 2 chapters is like a soft signal, like you want to open 5, maybe you could open 3, 4, or even 5, but you should act more quickly on that. And if you will allow me a very last point, and I might wish to have the view of people in the room on that. Regarding the dialogue between Serbia and Kosovo, I mean, at some point in one of the numerous statements of the External Election Service, it slipped into one of the statements that we are now moving into the next phase towards a final agreement. It is called a legally binding, comprehensive normalization agreement or something like that. I mean, my worry is that if there is no, at the end of the game, if there is no explicit recognition by either side, mutual recognition, I wonder what the 5 non-recognizing member states will say. Like, if I were one of them, I would say, either you mutually recognize, and I want to hear that word, recognize, in my presence, or we might not be happy with the situation and still not recognize Kosovo. So my question would be, could we have a bit more clarity in order not to have a major effort and arrive at a legally binding agreement which then encounters a lot of political stumble blocks?